Okay, this is part 10. Going to be talking about metabolism, energy. Where do we get that energy from? So, ATP is the only source that we use for contractile activity. We're talking about the relaxation for that myosin head to detach from the active site on actin. So we have some stores of ATP, but as soon as they're used up, which takes about 4 to 6 seconds, they're going to be regenerated by 3 different processes that will produce ATP. So the first is interaction of ADP with creatine phosphate. Next one is anaerobic glycolysis, which also could be considered part of aerobic respiration. Anaerobic means without oxygen, aerobic means with oxygen. So this really could turn into a rabbit hole, and I'm going to try and keep it as streamlined as possible because we don't have to go over all of the steps of aerobic respiration, talking about oxidative phosphorylation and chemiosmosis. So let's take a look at this chart. So creatine phosphate, what will end up happening, there's an enzyme, and it will interact with ADP, and it will strip the phosphate group from creatine phosphate to make creatine, and then we have ATP. So this is 1 ATP per creatine phosphate, so it's really not a good supply. All right, so here we have glucose gets broken down. The first step of respiration, of cellular respiration, is glycolysis, where glucose is 6 carbons, and it gets broken down into 2 3-carbon compounds that are called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. If oxygen is present, then that pyruvic acid, we can complete the oxidation, we can complete burning this to get energy, and it goes into the mitochondria, and we get around 36 ATP. Don't worry so much about the number, it's going to be in the mid-30s. Right, so we get a lot of energy. So this is going to be the best source. However, if oxygen isn't present, for reasons that I don't want to get into, we're talking about, we have these energy shuttles, these electron shuttles rather, and we need to regenerate this. Bottom line is, I just said I wasn't going to get into it. Bottom line is, things build up, and in order to continue to go through this process, in order to continue to go through glycolysis, we have to convert pyruvic acid. And that conversion, right, it will reduce pyruvic acid into lactic acid. And basically what that tells us is when you start running and you get out of breath, so your respiration and your heart rate increase to deliver this oxygen to all the mitochondria. But there's going to be some cells, because the oxygen demand is so great, there's going to be some cells where oxygen isn't present. So the cell has to basically say, okay, this would be great for us to get 36, but since oxygen isn't present, I want to keep going through glycolysis, so at least I get 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert pyruvic acid to lactic acid, and for reasons that I'm not getting into, that will allow the cell to continue to go through glycolysis. Not great, but better than nothing. So once lactic acid starts to build up, you know that you're going to be fatigued pretty soon because you're running out of oxygen. All right, so once this lactic acid builds up, it's going to go into the bloodstream, and it'll be picked up and burned by the liver, kidneys, and heart, and it's going to be converted back to pyruvic acid. So this muscle fatigue, right, it's just simply when the muscle can't contract, and that's when basically ATP production fails to keep pace with ATP use. And we're going to see that because lactic acid will accumulate in the muscle, and ionic imbalances are going to be present, right? Those action potentials are happening so rapidly, you're using the muscle so much that your sodium-potassium pump also can't keep up, right? So that's muscle fatigue. Now, when you're running and you stop running, it's not like your rate of respiration goes back to normal immediately, and that's because you're in something called oxygen debt. So there is a whole bunch of things that have to happen. So we have some oxygen reserves, all that lactic acid has to be converted back to pyruvic acid. Any glycogen that was broken down, that has to be replaced. ATP and creatine phosphate reserves have to be synthesized. And oxygen debt simply is the amount of oxygen needed for all of these restorative processes to take place. And that's why your respiration rate is still so high. All right, kind of shifting gears here. This is relatively straightforward. The force of muscle contraction. Two things: number of muscle fibers contracting. The more motor fibers, the stronger the contraction, and the size of the muscle. The bigger the muscle, the greater strength it will be able to generate. Neither of those should be a surprise there. Okay, last bit. You guys may have heard of fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. So we see muscle fibers have different processes by which they use ATP and produce ATP. Okay, so we can take a look at these two things. This talks about the speed of contraction. It's determined by the speed in which ATPase, that's an enzyme that splits ATP. We have two types, slow and fast. Not trying to be funny here. Fast will split ATP quickly. Slow is slow. So that's how quickly they will burn through ATP. Fast does it fast, slow does it slow. So that's how quickly they use it. Now this, the ATP forming pathways, talk about how do they make it. Oxidative fibers uses aerobic pathways, so they're getting about 36 ATP per glucose. Glycolytic fibers use anaerobic glycolysis, so they're getting about 2 ATP per glucose. So these two criteria define the three categories: slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. So we don't have slow glycolytic. There's no such thing as that, right? And this just talks about the different types of muscle fibers that we see. How much do they make? How quickly do they use it? So, slow oxidative fibers, they contract slowly, have slow ATPases, and they are fatigue resistant. Basically, they go through their ATP slowly, and they make a lot of it. So these guys are going to be fatigue resistant. And I'm not going to test you on this, but these are referred to as the type 1 or the red. Fast oxidative, these guys are going to have a moderate resistance because they go through ATP quickly, but they're oxidative, so they produce a lot. And then your fast glycolytic, they produce few ATP. That's the glycolytic. They produce few ATP, and they burn through it quickly. So these muscles are easily fatigued. Okay, and that's the end of this. One more, and I believe it's one more. It's going to be smooth muscle.